Welcome everybody to our speaker presentation, Saving the Hemlock Tree. My name is Michelle Diaz and I am the Education Program Manager for Trees Atlanta and I'll be your moderator for today's class. Today I'm going to be covering on some welcoming and introductions and then our speaker will be doing his presentation and there'll be opportunities for questions throughout the presentation. Trees Atlanta mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forests by planting, conserving, and education. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to ask the speaker, I will be allowing all of you to talk through Zoom. Please stay on, please stay muted during the presentation, and if you have a question for the speaker, feel free to unmute yourself. You can also utilize the chat or the Q&A tools, and I can read those questions to the speaker. Virtual education is still pretty new for Trees Atlanta. We will love your feedback on the format and on the content. So you'll be receiving um, a survey email after the event, and please send us your feedback. I'd like to invite you for our next virtual workshop, and it will be about invasive plant identification on Saturday, June 27th, 10 to 11 a.m. It will be virtual, and to sign up and get access to the link, please visit treesatlanta.org/calendar. And to stay in touch with us and learn more about upcoming events and volunteer projects, visit treesatlanta.org and follow us on social media. Our speaker today is Jack Rogers. He is the secretary on the board of directors for the American Chestnut Foundation for the Georgia chapter, and he's also the vice chairman of the Lumpkin Coalition. Thank you so much, Jack, for joining us, and have fun.
Thank you, Michelle. I believe I'm up. If someone could give me a confirmation that you can hear me, okay?
I'm sorry, Jack, we cannot hear you.
I do not show that I am muted, so, well, we worked it earlier. Now it says I'm unmute.
Oh, that's right. We can hear you now.
You can hear me, okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, in that case, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the presentation. I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to talk about the hemlock tree situation. I've been involved in it for quite a number of years. Michelle mentioned at the beginning that I also work with the American Chestnut Foundation. I'm on the Georgia chapter board on that also. I enjoy working with both of those trees. Today is going to be about the eastern hemlock and the Carolina hemlock. So as Michelle said, as I go through this, I hope to keep this very informal. And if there's anything I can do, answer any questions, or if the screen's not working, please just go ahead and unmute or type in a comment either way. And I'll go ahead and get started. So the eastern hemlock, which is primarily the species that we're worried about here in Georgia, there are two very similar species, the eastern hemlock and the Carolina hemlock. And I'll use my mouse. I think you guys can see the mouse cursor there. I'm guessing if you've joined this, you're probably familiar with what a hemlock tree looks like. The eastern hemlock is the one that we commonly see in North Georgia. It's a big matured evergreen tree, keeps its foliage all year round. It has very, very small needles, unlike a pine tree. They're a few millimeters long, and the hemlock tree range goes all the way well up into Maine, as you can see here. Sort of the southern end of the Appalachian foothills here. I'm up in Dahlonega, and we're basically right about the end of the range. I think once you get below about 1,500 feet MSL above sea level elevation, it gets too warm, and I don't think you typically see hemlocks. So I would say that hemlocks in the metro Atlanta area were probably planted. They do just fine. I've seen hundreds of them, but they're probably planted. They're probably not, were probably not originally there. Or if so, they were right at the very southern end of the range. The Carolina hemlock, I haven't really worked with it. I did pull up a range map, and it's a much smaller range. It's a very similar species, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure that I would be able to look at a tree and tell you which is which. They're pretty similar, I think. We use the term keystone species when we talk about hemlock trees. It's a real fundamental component of the Appalachian forest ecosystem. We typically see hemlocks. The largest, most dominant stands are typically along riverbanks and creeks in the low-lying areas. And they serve a very important purpose in that they shade the water and they keep the water temperatures down. So when these trees die, trout streams suddenly are not trout streams as well. There's a number of bird and insect species that depend on the hemlock tree for shelter, for food, for nesting. And so it's a pretty vital part of the landscape. I mentioned that that they are found most typically along rivers and streams and creeks, but that is not to say that they don't also inhabit up on ridges. You don't see them as often, but they can certainly be found up on higher elevations as well. So, all right. So the next thing is we'll talk about what's going on and why this is a problem. So in the 1950s, an insect we believe was imported from Asia. It's an insect called the Hemlock woolly adelgid, and it's a tiny little bug, generally not visible to the eye. This is zoomed in quite a bit, and they spread rapidly up and down the eastern seaboard, and they attach themselves to the tiny little needles, typically on new growth. And when they do that, they suck the sap out, and they weaken the tree. And over a course of several years, they generally kill the tree. I've seen fatality estimates in the range of 90%. I will make a comment about the mortality on these, and that is that it's extremely variable from the experience that I've seen. It's variable in the sense that it depends a lot upon the habitat that the tree is in. If it's in a place where it's getting good water near a creek or a river, it's probably going to have a better ability to survive. Most of them are going to eventually succumb. Another big variable that seems to kind of bedevil our efforts to understand this is the climate. We get extremely dry periods. When we're in a drought period, the trees get really stressed, and so they're much less able to defend themselves, and we see a much more rapid decline. When we have wet periods, the trees seem to be able to hang on longer periods. So it's hard to put a specific number and say that when your tree becomes infested, it's got 3 years to live or 5 years to live. Like so many other things, it really depends on a lot of conditions. What you see here, the range map shows the spread began in the Virginia area in the 1950s, and it has now spread essentially throughout the range. I moved to Dahlonega in 2005, and the adelgid infestation had just begun to creep into northeast Georgia, up near Clayton in that area there, and was becoming established. And over the next 3 to 5 years, it's pretty much spread, and it is fully spread throughout Lumpkin County, or the Dahlonega area, which is where I am now. So it's spread, it's become established. And as you get into areas where the infestation got started, let's say 10, 15, 20 years ago, this is what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of mortality, a lot of stands of dead hemlock trees. We are now starting to see that here in Lumpkin County, and I am starting to see standing dead hemlock trees. And that's really just been in the last few years. So let's see. This is what the bug looks like on a heavily infested tree. What you can see to the eye are these little white balls of, they're actually webs or nests. And that's the only thing. The actual insects are so small that I think you can see them with a magnifying glass, but typically you will see these little woolly nests or egg sacs, and that is your indication that the tree is infested. So I will make a pitch for the fact that I'm not a practicing scientist or professional scientist, but I enjoy working with this. I consider myself an environmentalist, and I think this is another example, with the chestnut, American chestnut restoration efforts being another one as well, where everyday folks who are interested and concerned about the environment, really, we the scientific community need citizen science to be involved, to make a difference and to be successful. So if you're interested in this, there's opportunities to get involved, and I encourage you to do so. So I think a lot of people that are participating today are interested because they have trees on their property or trees that they care about, and they want to know, what can I do? How do I save these trees? And do I need to? So we can talk a little bit about that initially. And as I already mentioned, these little white egg sacs are your indication. I will mention that these egg sacs are not visible 12 months out of the year. Without going into the biology, which I'm not really qualified to discuss in detail, there are two life cycle or two generations per year of the hemlock woolly adelgid, and there are periods of time where these egg sacs are not visible, or if they're there, they're really eroded to the point where you might see some remnants of them. But if you look at your hemlock tree at any random time and you don't see any evidence of egg sacs, you need to monitor, because the absence of those is not necessarily a positive indication that the tree is not infested. If you keep an eye on it over the course of a year, you will see the egg sacs come and go. At this point here in early June, up in Dahlonega, the trees that I'm seeing are still very visibly infested. I have a good many trees on my property here, and they are infested with hemlock woolly adelgid, and I can see the egg sacs still. I expect that will, as the summer wears on, that will become less and less. So you do need to be aware that there are times when the infestation can be difficult to see. Okay, so let's say we have trees. Is there?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I got a question.
We have a
here.
question from the chat.
Sure.
Is there 100% mortality, or have any trees shown resistance?
Okay. I don't know of a peer-reviewed study that would put a number on it. The only number that I've ever seen informally was 90 to 95% mortality. Now, as far as resistance is concerned, I'm not aware of any scientific studies that have identified a strain of trees that does show resistance in the natural environment. That would obviously be great. and it's certainly worth pursuing scientifically. But as far as I know, there are not, no one has identified that, hey, here's a tree that for some reason is able to defend itself. I did get some information, this was probably close to 2 years ago, that the USDA Department of Agriculture was working on doing some hybridization research to try to develop a hybrid that might be resistant. And I don't have any current information on that. As far as I know, there is I'm not aware of any active developments in terms of trying to plant a resistant hybrid, which is obviously unlike if you're familiar with the American chestnut, that's the whole ball game with the chestnuts, is developing a resistant hybrid tree, and that is showing success, but not in the hemlock world that I'm aware of. So I hope I answered your question. Unfortunately, no, not that I know of. There are a couple of different approaches that we can take to preserve the trees. I don't really feel like it's necessary for me to go into why we want to preserve the trees. To me, it's pretty self-evident why these trees are valuable. And it will be very devastating. The losses of these trees has already proven to be pretty devastating in the ecosystem. So what we want to do is we want to preserve as many of the trees as we can, with the hopes that in the long term, we will develop a biological control strategy, which I'll talk about here in a few minutes, that we hope will be the long-term solution. In the short term, say in the next 15, 20 years or so, it's highly likely that vast numbers of these trees are going to succumb to this. Unfortunately, there's just not any practical way to go into public lands, with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these trees and do the chemical treatments, which I'll talk about here now. So there are really two strategies to saving the trees. The short-term strategy is to use an insecticide treatment, a chemical treatment. And that is pretty much the only game in town if you have a tree or an area of trees that is just really vital that it be saved. It does work. It is effective. It is not terribly expensive. It was fairly prohibitively expensive until about 10 years ago. And then the patent expired on the main chemical. And so the price has gone down very dramatically in the last few years, to the point now where it is definitely a practical solution for private property owners that have trees. And generally, I do encourage people, if you have private property, I do encourage people to try to preserve your trees in the short term using a chemical approach. Having said that, that is not a very straightforward question. So I would like to go into some detail about the chemical treatments. There are two basic chemicals that are available and are labeled for treating hemlock trees that are infested with the hemlock woolly adelgid. The two chemicals, the first one is called imidacloprid, and it is a generic now. It's widely available. It's inexpensive. It's not on a patent or anything, and that is primarily the primary chemical that was used for a long time, and is still used widely today. There is another chemical, dinoturfuron, and that is a brand name Safari. I believe there are other brands, but you will hear people talk about using Safari. The two chemicals are complementary. They each have advantages and disadvantages, which I'll go into. They're systemic. There are a variety of treatment methods that can be applied. People use a trench where they drench the trench with the chemical. What you see in the picture here is a soil injection method. This is probably, I don't know if I would put a number on it, but pretty much that's the way most people are doing it. It's an effective way. It delivers it right where it needs to. There are also bark sprays and also bark injection, but those are not something that are done very much. So by and large, what you're going to see is a solution of the chemical is mixed into this tank, and it's like a gigantic hypodermic needle, and it's injected directly into the roots of the trees. And then the tree roots take the chemical up, and it's a systemic insecticide, and it works. I think that that is pretty much beyond any doubt. Both of the chemicals work. This slide says 7 years. I was talking to a friend of mine who does this commercially this morning to get the last, most recent data, and they are now thinking that an effective, professionally applied treatment could potentially be effective for up to 10 years. I don't think they're definitively saying that, but 7 years, 5 to 7 years is for sure well established on this. The chemicals can be applied by homeowners in a DIY, a do-it-yourself mode. There is obviously toxicity concerns. The imidacloprid is the less toxic of the two. I have done a good bit of that myself. I've treated my own trees with that. I have not used the Safari. It is something that requires more concern and carefulness as far as handling it. I'm not in a position to recommend DIY. Having said that, though, the Georgia Forestry Commission, most of the Forestry Commission sites have these injectors, and they will loan them to you along with instructions. The chemicals are widely available, at least the imidacloprid, which is the common chemical, are generally available at like feed and seed stores and that, so you can get it online and so on. So imidacloprid is the first one that became widely used. Now, the big issue with imidacloprid is it is in the family of insecticides called neonicotinoids. And if you follow environmental causes, you're probably familiar that neonicotinoids have been implicated in the colony collapse disorder with honeybees and other pollinators. So this is a judgment call. Now, what I've read is that the honeybee situation has been a major problem in Europe, and imidacloprid is being applied on flowering crops directly during flowering season. So there's a very clear pathway between the chemical application and the bees. In a hemlock situation where the chemical is being injected directly into the ground, and it's not being taken up into a flower that a honeybee or another bee is going to be attracted to, there is, I think, a reasonable assumption that the pathway to bee colonies is probably pretty severely attenuated. What we have had conversations about, very commonly, you will see hemlock trees in areas where sourwood trees are also found. And if you inject this chemical into the soil in the vicinity of a sourwood tree, now you have introduced a flowering tree systemically. And so a lot of people, and I'm included in that, generally say that we don't want to inject this chemical anywhere near sourwoods or other flowering trees. Let's see, reasonable cost. I'm going to throw a number out here for chemical treatment, and this would be by a professional company that does this for a living. There are a number of companies in North Georgia that do this. For imidacloprid, you are approximately $1 per inch of tree. And again, that's a very anecdotal number, but, and so how would you translate that? If you have a tree that is 10 inches in diameter it's called DBH, diameter at breast height. If you have a 10-inch DBH tree, you're going to probably be in the neighborhood of $10 to treat that tree. That would be protect that tree pretty effectively for 5 to 7 years, or perhaps longer. So not a totally prohibitive cost when you consider the value of the tree, especially if you're talking about trees that are near a house. If the tree dies, it becomes a danger to the house. It's going to cost hundreds or thousands of dollars to have it professionally removed. So in general, we tell people, I feel like spending a few dollars to save these trees is probably the best bet in the long term. Another concern with chemicals is where does the chemical go? And as it metabolizes, this to me is probably the larger issue, and that is this stuff probably hangs around in the environment. We know that the tree takes it up. The needles have the chemicals in it. The needles eventually die and fall to the ground. And so this chemical probably has some lifespan. And I don't know that we fully understand the metabolism and how long and its effect on, for example, microfauna in the duff. We have to make a reasonable assumption that it probably does have a negative effect on that. How severe it is, we don't know. It is being studied. So there are obviously issues with the imidacloprid, so that's pushing us to try to find a better solution other than just filling the forest with insecticide. There are sites in the national forest. I'm familiar with Chattahoochee National Forest specifically, but I know that there are some sites where chemical treatment is being done. It has gone through the management approval process. And so there are some, but in terms of, if you look at the Chattahoochee National Forest with hundreds of thousands of hemlocks, it's not practical or frankly desirable to chemically treat and save all those trees. So the other chemical, let's see, do I have a slide on this? Bear with me here. Yeah, no, let's stay on the slide. So there's another chemical.
We have a question too here.
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay, so this is coming through the Q&A, and the question is, should these chemicals be applied as a preventative or after the insects are observed?
Good question, very good question. Generally, we would not recommend it to be used in a preventative way. If you have trees and you monitor them, you conduct surveillance on them and you don't see any evidence, I would not recommend that they be treated. And for a couple of reasons. One, you may be wasting your money. We're putting insecticide into the environment for probably no good reason. And really the other reason is that when the tree becomes infested, it generally takes several years before the tree is significantly harmed. So if you're checking your trees several times a year and you're not seeing the adelgids, I would not recommend treating them in a prophylaxis manner. I would just keep your eye on them, and when you do see them, now you have time to act to save them. So great question on that. So the other chemical that I'll talk briefly about is dinotefuran. It's labeled Safari, and it is a much more rapid-acting chemical. The imidacloprid is a slow-acting chemical. Generally, you're looking at injecting, and it's going to be several months before you're going to begin to see any real effect. That's a good thing and a bad thing. It's good because it means it's slow to take effect, but it's also slow to wear off. So if you have a tree that is in really dire straits, it's in your front yard, and it would break your heart to see that tree be killed, and you realize that it's been infested and it's in severe, it's already in pretty bad damage. The professionals are going to recommend a rapid treatment with this Safari or dinotefuran treatment. The dinotefuran acts very rapidly. It's generally also done by a soil injection, but it will knock the adelgids out very quickly. And so if you have a really valuable tree and you need quick action, then Safari is probably going to be your best choice. The bad news about Safari is that it doesn't last as long. 2 to 3 years is probably the maximum that you would get out of it. And unfortunately, it's also more expensive. It's about twice as expensive to treat a tree with safari. So you're looking at about $2 per inch to treat trees. What I think most of the professional applicators are now recommending is to actually treat with both chemicals, and that's how they're hoping to get this 10-year span to have it be successful. So again, safari is an insecticide. Anytime we're putting insecticide into the environment, we got concerns about that. So I'm going to move on to what we hope is the longest or the longer term and better solution, and that's the biological control methods that my group, Lumpkin Coalition, is focused on. Are there any other questions about chemical treatment at this point?
I didn't see any other questions, Jack,
Okay.
in the chat right now.
All right. Well, we treat, or we talk about we being the group, and I'll mention just briefly the organization, the nonprofit that I work with up here in Dahlonega is a 501c3 called the Lumpkin Coalition. It's a very loose-knit, informal nonprofit that was founded back in 2005, and it was founded to help save hemlock trees. In the intervening years, we've branched out, and we're doing some other things as well, including the American chestnut. But we are the group that every year puts on a music festival up here in the Dahlonega area called Hemlock Fest. We've done that for 15 consecutive years, and we've raised an awful lot of money to support research into the biological control. So that's actually the group that I represent for this talk is the Lumpkin Coalition. So, so with that, let's turn to what we hope is the real solution to this, and that is biological control. So this research has been going on for, I would guess, more than 20 years at this point, maybe even 25 years. I don't have the full history on it. I know that when I got to Georgia, I moved here from retirement in 2005, and it was already well developed. So this involves bringing in other organisms, other living organisms, in this case, some very, very small beetle species that the Hemlock woolly adelgid is their food source. This is what they eat. And so this research is showing some really good promise. Where this originated was, I'll kind of give a little bit of history on this and a little of the ecology of it. In various places in Asia, there are hemlock species. They're very, very similar to the hemlock trees that we have here in the Eastern Seaboard. And they have Hemlock woolly adelgids. And the Hemlock woolly adelgids live on them and live off of them. However, in these Asian situations, the adelgid also has another predator, and there's a variety of different other insects that eat the adelgids. And so what that gives us is that gives us an equilibrium. We have the hemlock tree that is the host to the adelgid, and then we have other species that also live on the tree that use the adelgid as a food source. And they keep each other in balance. So there's sort of a fluctuating dynamic equilibrium. And in that equilibrium, the adelgids are there. They never go away, but they never get so dense that they kill the tree, or they don't kill very many trees. I'm sure there is a evolutionary aspect of this that I'm not sure has been studied, but if you go into the forest, hemlock forests in Japan, for example, you will find Hemlock woolly adelgids, and the trees survive. And the reason they survive is because there are these predator beetles that prevent the adelgids from getting too out of control. So here we are on the Eastern Seaboard of the United States. We have hemlocks, but we don't have any Hemlock woolly adelgids, which means we also don't have species that eat the Hemlock woolly adelgids. 1951, bang, we get Hemlock woolly adelgids. There's no natural predator to keep it in check. And that's the same old story that we see over and over again. So the goal, if you want to think of it in a big picture way, is we want to intervene and recreate that equilibrium by introducing these species that will prey on and keep the adelgids in check. And it's took me a while when I first started looking into this and learning about it to understand that that's a difficult thing to do. When you introduce a whole bunch of beetles into an area, for example, if they eat all the adelgids to the point where they wipe the adelgid population out, now they have nothing to eat, and so they get wiped out. So it's figuring out how to reach that equilibrium is going to be the real challenge on it. But the good news is that once we get there, it should be a solution that will generally take care of itself and gradually spread throughout the range of the hemlocks. So very optimistic that this is going to work. There are a number of different species that are being released or have been being released. I'll talk about two primary ones here in just a minute. The question that always comes up at this point when I talk about this is, are you sure you're not introducing the next kudzu? In other words, we're bringing in a species that's actually going to turn out to be a bigger problem than the problem that we're trying to fix. And the best answer that I can give to that is that we are following the protocols from the federal government, and we do have federal permits. We being the community, I'm focused on the North Georgia efforts, but there are all the way up to Maine. There are organizations doing this kind of work, and so these releases are being done under federal permits. And sort of the bottom line on that is that if we can show that these beetles, these species or these organisms will only eat hemlock woolly adelgids, and they're not going to go branching out and eat something else that's a good insect, then it's okay, and we've been able to do that. And I will just anecdotally, there is a beetle species that I don't have listed up here called Scymnus coniferarium. It's we talk about these in abbreviations, SCW, and we did have release approval to release those for a while, and then there became evidence that no, the SCW, yep, they like hemlock woolly adelgid, but maybe they're eating some other stuff too, and so that permitting has been withdrawn, and we're no longer able to use the SCW. So we are being careful about that as far as releasing this stuff into the wild. So let me talk briefly about the two species that are kind of the lead. There are other species, and depending on where you are in the country, there are different organisms. I know that further north, I think there's some excitement about an insect called the silverfly. But down here in the North Georgia area, the two species that we see are on the right, Sasaja scymnus tsugae, which we refer to as ST. And if you talk to our beetle lab folks who are into the education aspect, they call that the sassy beetle. Interesting, if you notice in the picture here, these beetles are about the size of a poppy seed. They're really, really small things. You think of a ladybug, they're actually in the ladybug family, but they're maybe 1/20th the size of a ladybug, a ladybird beetle. So tiny little things. They are visible to the naked eye, but they're not very big. ST, or Sasaja scymnus tsugae, is the first beetle that was brought in. This is a species that was brought in from Japan, and I haven't seen any recent numbers, but it's been being released into the environment for more than 20 years. I would guess probably millions have been released at this point. And what's happening is that research institutions up and down have developed the ability to rear these beetles in the labs. And so, for example, in Dahlonega at the University of North Georgia, there's the Ecological Protection Lab, the beetle lab, and this is one of the things they do. They rear thousands of these, and we release them out into the wild. University of Georgia, UGA, also rears beetles, and there's a beetle rearing operation at Young Harris up in North Georgia as well. So that's the ST beetle. It is believed to be pretty effective. Not everybody would agree with that. There is, when you talk about science, people do get heated, and there is controversy. And there are folks out there that don't think that ST is the greatest beetle in the world, which brings me to the other very popular beetle, especially in the South, and that is Laricobius nigrinus on the left there. Also a very, very tiny beetle, and we refer to that as LN or Larry, the labs call it. So you've got Sassy and Larry are our two beetles. Laricobius is also being reared in the lab. More challenging to rear the Laricobius beetle, but all three of the labs, unless I'm mistaken, I know UNG and UGA are rearing Laricobius. I believe Young Harris has gotten in on that now. So one of the interesting challenges with rearing these beetles in the lab is, what do you feed them? And so actually one of the more labor intensive aspects of this is going out into the forest. We have groups, the Georgia Forestry Commission has been helping us out on this. They go out and they harvest adelgid infested hemlock fronds and branches, and they bring them into the lab, and we feed the beetles that are being reared in the lab on hemlocks that are brought in from the wild that have the adelgids on them. So a brief note about the two species. These species are actively feeding at different times of the year. And so the consensus, if such a thing exists in science, there appears to be a gathering consensus that the best approach, at least here in the southern end of the range, is going to be both of these beetles working together, so that there's a pressure on the adelgid throughout the life cycle. The adelgid life cycle, they actually produce 2 generations per year, and they can reproduce very rapidly. So those are the 2 beetle species. Let's see.
We have a few questions in the chat.
Sure. Yeah. Go right ahead.
All right. So I think this question is more about the chemical control.
Okay.
So the question is, I have a pollinator garden in my front yard where my hemlock trees are. Will the toxins be absorbed into those plants? My yard is also a wildlife habitat. Many birds visit feeders and stay year round. Will they be harmed when they perch in the trees?
That is a difficult question to give you a firm answer on. I think it would depend on how far away the roots of the hemlock tree are from the pollinator plants. I don't believe that there's any harm to birds, but to insects, especially pollinator insects. So it is entirely possible. Now, there are some less lethal treatments. They're not easy. You can do an insecticidal soap, depending on how large the tree is, but you pretty much have to spray the entire tree. So it would depend. I guess my first question would be, is the tree infested with adelgids now? If it's not infested, then I would say definitely don't treat it. So that will be a judgment call, and that would be a good one for a professional arborist, someone. I am not an arborist. I'm not a biologist. I'm a citizen scientist. So, but again, a tough question to answer there. I'm hoping that maybe your tree's not infested yet.
Yeah, and then I know we touched on this a little bit before. Is there any preventative care?
Not that I am aware of. I mean, I suppose that you could, there'd be no reason why you couldn't apply one of the, I would probably go with the imidacloprid, the slow acting chemical. And if you've applied that, then I would guess that that would have a preventative action on it. I'm not aware of anyone advocating for that. And I'll talk just briefly about one aspect of this, especially for the metro Atlanta area, and that is the spread of the adelgid. We think that the primary vector for this pest being spread across the landscape is birds and possibly windborne. The actual insects themselves, the adelgids, are not mobile and they do not fly. They attach themselves to the tree, to the needles, and they stay put. So they're not mobile. They don't go flying over to the next uninfested tree. They are spread by some vector, and the general thought is that probably primarily birds. So up here where there's lots and lots of hemlocks, and you know, you can't go a few hundred yards without encountering a hemlock, it's spread pretty rapidly. When you get down into the metro area, though, where you may not have, you may have a very low density of hemlocks, I think it's very likely that you might not get infested. If you have some hemlocks on your property and the nearest other hemlocks are half a mile or a mile away, the odds are that that you might not ever get infested. That would if you're the type that's out in the woods in North Georgia all the time, be aware that you could bring that stuff back with you. And so if you're around hemlock trees, you need to be aware that this is something that you definitely don't want to bring home with you. So I think I answered that. Was there any other questions, Michelle?
Yeah, the other question is, are young hemlock trees just as vulnerable to the infestation? If I wanted to purchase a 10-footer hemlock tree at a local nursery, should I worry about the potential bug infestation?
The trees can get infested even very, very small. I have trees here in my yard that are 18 inches high and they have adelgids on them. And my guess would be, and this is speculative on my part, but my guess would be that a very small tree with a heavy infestation is probably vulnerable. It probably could be damaged and killed pretty quickly compared to a very large tree. As far as nursery purchases of a 10-foot tree, my assumption would be that a credible, a reputable nursery would make sure that the tree is not infested. And so you probably would be okay there, and you might be able to, you know, have them guarantee that, you know, over the course of a year. But again, you can't really guarantee. You don't know where the adelgids are, and so it's always possible that you could purchase a tree that's not infested, and in a year or so, it could, just through bad luck, you could have an infestation. So, okay.
Yeah, that's all the questions for now.
Okay, so we've talked about the biological control methods, and so I'm running out of material here, which is fine. I think the time is getting short. Just in the last year, I do want to mention that the University of North Georgia campus here in Dahlonega has the Ecological Protection Lab. They are open to the public if you want to go in and see beetles being reared and talk to some incredibly interesting people who are just all about this. They can tell you, they've forgotten more than I know, but that lab is open to the public. I don't know the exact hours, but you can find that on the web, and I have a link at the end of this. They're delighted to have people come in, and they really can give you the most current information. Stacy James is the director of that facility up there, and she is a dynamo. Just in the last 2 years, that lab has been we've been releasing for years and years and years. And so now the next question is it working? Are we just dumping beetles out and they're dying and nothing's happening? And so the answer to that is that we now know is that no, they're not. We now can clearly and repeatedly document that beetles have been released into the environment at a number of sites across North Georgia. And years later, they're still there. So that tells us that they've established, they're reproducing, and they're settling in. So that's the first bit of good news. And that's pretty much, I think, well established that they are not being, they are successfully being introduced into the environment. The second question then is it working? Does just once we get the beetles out there and they get established, is it in fact protecting the trees? Much more difficult question to answer. It's very difficult to quantitatively measure what the effect is on a hemlock tree, but there is, I think, a growing consensus that the beetles are working. I can't quote numbers or specific studies, but what I'm hearing through the network of people that are working on this is that, yeah, you go into an area where beetles were released 5 or 6 years ago, and as you approach the area, you notice that the hemlock trees are clearly becoming much more healthy. You can walk in other areas where you see dying hemlocks and dead hemlocks. So that's a pretty good news story. And then this one is the one that and this is actually about 18 months old now, as they have documented. UNG is going out and doing recoveries where they will go to sites where beetles have been released. They will try to confirm whether the beetles are still there or not. And by the way, this is a tough science, because you remember these beetles are about the size of a poppy seed, and you walk up to a tree that's, say, 70 or 80 feet tall, and you go, how many beetles are on that tree? It's practically impossible to do that. What they can do, though, is they can confirm that, yeah, we can recover beetles from that. So they are doing beetle recovery studies at the release sites, but they're now also branching out, and they've found several documented cases where they have a site where there have not been any releases, 3 miles from the nearest release site, and they're recovering beetles. So they're surviving, appears that they're working to protect the tree, and they're spreading. So that is pretty huge. That's pretty huge. Okay. So the last couple of things that I'll talk about are getting involved. What we're saying right now is that chemical treatment is probably still, for private property owners, chemical treatment is still probably your best option. I just looked this morning, and there is at least 2 websites now that are advertising that you can buy ST beetles. They're about $2.50 per beetle was the number that I saw this morning. I'm not going to recommend that individuals do that at this point. I think the jury is still a little bit out, but it is an option. You can buy ST beetles. I'm not aware of anyone selling the LN beetles, but that is could change. So if you have private property, you have trees that you need to protect, the short-term answer is you probably need to monitor them closely, and if they're infested, they probably need a chemical treatment. We're going to continue doing research on the biological control method. We want to document the rate of spread and use that information to figure out what's the best and most efficient way to release these things in the environment, so that we get gradually we develop that equilibrium that I talked about. The labs here in Georgia are funded primarily by volunteer stuff, fundraising, one of the main ones, and I will hope that you guys will support this, is Hemlock Fest. This is the music festival that Lumpkin Coalition puts on every year. Unfortunately, it's not looking good for this year. We haven't made a final determination, but I don't think it's going to happen in 2020. We've had 15 consecutive years of great concerts. It's a 3-day event. up in the mountains of North Georgia. We have about 22 bands. There's on-site camping, there's canoeing. It's very reasonably priced. And over the 15-year period, I believe, I haven't done the math recently, but I think we're close to $250,000. I think we've probably donated about $250,000, raised and donated. We are 100% volunteer. We have no paid staff whatsoever. There are expenses, obviously, to putting on a 3-day music festival, but they're kept in check. And encourage you to keep that on your radar scope. We have every expectation that when we are able to do that again, we will do it. The festival is always the first full weekend in November. It's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And it's a very family-oriented event. We have a kids' village. There's education. We have expert panels that if you have questions about the science or the technical, we have representatives from companies that do this commercially. It's just a fabulous experience. I've got involved in 2008 and have been heavily involved with it since then. And I'm now the vice chairman of the group that puts it on. So if you're at all interested, Google Hemlock Fest. I get asked a lot about hemlocks, and no, it's not the hemlock that Socrates took. It's a different organism, but it's a great tree, and it's a great cause. And I'll end up really just by saying that because the group, Lumpkin Coalition, we're all volunteers. If you're even remotely inclined to get involved in this, we always need people to help us put this festival on. Not this year probably, but if you have any interest in getting involved in this, we would love to talk to you on that. And with that, Michelle, I think, the only other thing I have is I have some links there that I don't really feel a need to go through. And I don't have a link, but I will make a pitch for the company that I have had the most contact with that does this commercially, that does chemical treatment, is a company called adelgid. They're up in, I believe they're in Habersham County, but they travel all over and very reputable and very reasonable. And so if you're interested, I would point you in their direction. Jan George is the owner of that company. He's a great guy. So with that, I maybe we'll have another question or two. Looks like the time is just about up.
Sure. So there's 2 questions here. One from the chat is, I understand that the hemlocks have an important role in shading streams where fish grow. The death of the trees then impact the cold water fishing. Have fishing interests helped in preservation process?
Yes, I know that Trout Unlimited has done some support for the research. I don't know the details of that, but I know that they're very aware of this and very concerned about it. So yeah, it's a problem, and I think it's a bigger problem here in the southern end of the range where the summers we get good hot summers. But yes, the trout community is definitely aware of the problem and is definitely interested in whatever steps can be taken to protect hemlocks.
And then the other question is, can the hemlock beetles infestation affect other plants and trees nearby?
Not that I am aware of. As far as I know, the hemlock, the 2 hemlocks. Now, I could be wrong about that. I'm not aware that specifically the hemlock woolly adelgid. Obviously, there's very, very many invasive insect species that are causing lots and lots of problems with trees. I'm not aware that this particular bug has been problematic for any other tree species, though.
Yeah, and that's all the questions coming from the chat and the Q&A. If anybody would like to ask any other questions to Jack, you're able to unmute yourself if you like, or send the comments through the chat. Maybe we'll give them a few minutes, but thank you so much, Jack, for your time and for the good work that you're doing.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm glad to do it.
Right. So if there's any other questions, feel free to email me at Michelle, Michelle, at treesatlanta.org, and I'll make sure to pass them to Jack also. Well, thank you, and hope to see you around at at other classes. And thank you. Have a good day, Jack.
You're welcome, Michelle, and I will email you the latest version of this of the PowerPoint here as soon as I get off.
Sounds good. Thank you. Have a good
All right,
day.
you're very welcome. Thanks, everyone.